Good morning, everyone. I'm Dick Kelly, and with me is Alyssa Sanford. I'm a senior partner in the chemical practice group and the head of the life science practice group, while Alyssa is a member of our litigation group and also life science practice group. Now, while we're waiting for people to continue to join, I'll go through a few housekeeping things. First, if you have questions as we go along, you can use the Q&A box to ask us, and we'll try to answer them as we go. Or you can email either Alyssa or myself afterwards with your questions. The slides that we're going to use, as well as this video, will be available on our website, probably within a day or two of the conclusion of the presentation. Now, the presentation itself is the relationship between drugs, labels, patent claims, and infringement. Now let's go to the first slide. And our objective for today is to provide you with information which will allow you to capture uses which are going to allow you to extend your exclusivity. During the development of drugs, quite often a number of important discoveries are made during the clinical phase of the development, which is usually towards the tail end on the timeline of a drug development. And they offer if you can get patents and get them on the label, they can offer you an extended exclusivity period that will withstand court challenge and keep generics out. Now here, what we're talking about is the label primarily, because it's the label that will induce infringement. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that that label is going to actually induce infringement of the developments that you've claimed in your patents. And as I say, if it's done right, we can get a nice long exclusive period. For instance, with the drug Multac, they had a patient selection invention that they made shortly before their NDA was approved. And their exclusive period went from 10 years to 20 years. So that's what we're talking about trying to do here. Let's go to the next slide, Alyssa. Now, most of the developments we're going to be talking about are going to be based on inherent drug properties. And it's important to recognize that inherent drug properties are themselves not patentable. What you have to do is carefully draft your claims to grab property and to use the property. Until the inherent property is known, you can't use it. And so that's part of your invention. Second thing you then have to do is make sure that what you're doing, your use of the invention, is actually on your label. Let's go to the third slide. Or next slide, Alyssa. Now, as I said at the beginning, it's the drug label that's going to induce infringement. And the only time a generic's going to actually infringe is when they sell the drug that's patented or the drug formulation that's patented. To the extent that you're claiming the use or indication of a drug, the generic company is not a direct infringer. They're only an inducer of infringement. Now, throughout this presentation, we may use the term indication or use interchangeably. Use is what we call it in the patent world. Indication is what they call it in the FDA world. And they both mean the same thing. It's the condition to be treated. Now, in the real world, generic companies are simply order takers. They don't have any detail men like the branded products do to inform doctors about uses of the drugs they sell or any particularly unique features of the drugs. So the only way you can get inducement is from the label distributed with the drug. Now the good news is 35 U.S.C. 271E2 gives you a powerful tool to exclude generics before they get approved by the FDA. And the label is the key there. Now let's go to the next slide. Now the label is what everybody sees. And everybody's aware that if you have only one indication, then the generic label must have that indication. But where you have multiple indications, and only one or less than all of them have patents that are in force, the generic manufacturers can exclude from their label the uses which remain under patent. And that's called the skinny label, which today is rather controversial in view of the Teva litigation. Now, while you can eliminate patented indications from the label, the generic cannot exclude things which relate to safety or efficacy from the label that apply to all the indications. These are things like dosing, patient selection, avoiding an adverse event. These are things that cannot be avoided. Let's go to the next slide.
Check it out.
Now, in order for this to work for you, it's necessary that you have good communication between the groups which are doing the development work. You've got the clinical developers who are developing the tests and getting the results and evaluating those results. They need to be telling IP what's happening so that you can determine whether or not there's something there that's patentable. You need to be in contact with regulatory because it doesn't do you any good to get a patent if the regulatory people submit a label which doesn't induce infringement. Now, one group I've left off is marketing. Many times the marketing people will have a better idea of what's going to sell the drug to the doctors than either the clinical or regulatory people. So they should be involved as well. But the key is to not isolate IP from the opportunities that are being developed by the clinicians. If you put IP in a silo, you're going to miss opportunities to get that extended exclusivity period. Next slide. Now I'm going to turn this over to Alyssa in a second, but this is the example that I mentioned where you could get a really long extension by following carefully the clinical developments. And the Sanofi case is probably the best example and an excellent one because they went from 10 years of product exclusivity under a patent to 20 years. Alyssa?
Thanks, Dick. So Sanofi, they own two patents, this formulation patent and a patient selection patent. And the patient selection patent expired 10 years after the formulation patent. Both are directed to the cardiovascular antiarrhythmic drug called dronedarone, but the brand name is Multac, and that's how I'll refer to it from now on. So the patient selection patent claims methods of reducing hospitalization due to congestive heart failure by administering Multac to patients that have certain characteristics. And so the label that Sanofi included with Multac states it's indicated to reduce the risk of hospitalization for atrial fibrillation in patients with a history of persistent atrial fibrillation and refers to clinical studies that were conducted to determine certain cardiovascular benefits and the drug's safety. So the defendants here, Watson and Sandoz, wanted to market generic versions of Multac, and they filed ANDAs or ANDAs along with paragraph 4 certifications, which certify the belief that the patents were invalid or that the manufacturer of the generic would not infringe. And upon getting notice of those filings, Sanofi sued them both. So at the district court level, the court found for Sanofi that the proposed generics with their proposed labels would induce physicians to infringe. also found that Watson did not prove any of the asserted claims were obvious. So the Federal Circuit affirmed, noting that to prove inducement of infringement, Sanofi had to establish that Watson had the specific intent to encourage another's infringement, which can be based on the drug label if the label encourages, recommends, or promotes infringement. So the Federal Circuit held that the drug label here directed medical providers to information identifying the drug's desired benefit only for patients having the claimed risk factors. So the label itself had a short one-sentence indications and usage section to section 1, stating it's indicated to reduce the risk of hospitalization for atrial fibrillation. And then it goes on to state which patients are covered by that indication, which is patients in sinus rhythm with a history of paroxysmal or persistent atrial fibrillation. And the label also references the clinical studies we noted earlier. And it's worth noting, too, that the reference in section 14, that clinical studies section that was made in section 1, that indications and usage section, is optional, but it is helpful, and that is how the label was set up here. So that reference to the clinical studies section essentially directs medical providers to information identifying the desired benefit for only patients with those claimed risk factors where the benefit and the stated objective was reduced hospitalization.
Alyssa, just 1 second. The section 14 in the patient treatment section listed all of the claimed elements and then showed what the effect was of different patients. So continue, Alyssa.
Thanks. So for induced infringement under 271B, there is a requirement that the defendant knew of the patent and also that the induced acts constitute infringement. So in this instance, neither of the knowledge requirements were in dispute. That is, if and when the defendants received FDA approval and marketed the generic version of Multac with the label at issue, they would know of the patent in suit and that the medical provider's administration of the drug to the claimed class of patients is an act of infringement. So the issue in this case really focuses in on the connection between the marketing and the medical provider's infringement, where the defendant must have the specific intent to encourage another's infringement, and where the defendant knew or should have known their acts would induce infringement. So here the Federal Circuit felt that there was considerable testimony that the label encourages or would be known by defendants to encourage administration of the drug to those patients with the claimed risk factors. And specifically, Sanofi testified that a person of skill in the art would understand from the label that only FDA-approved uses of the drug resulted from the clinical trials, and that a physician would be encouraged from the label to use the drug in a manner that infringes the patent. And that's key in improving inducement based on a drug label, where the label must encourage infringement of the claims by containing the claim limitations, and there must be evidence that doctors prescribed the drug to at least some patients due to the label, which Sanofi was able to do in this case. It's interesting that 77% of these Multac prescriptions were written for patients with these claimed risk factors. So the defendant also argued that because there are substantial non-infringing uses for the drug, it would not induce infringement, and the Federal Circuit rejected that argument simply because the existence of substantial non-infringing uses is not a limitation on inducement, something the Supreme Court held back in 2005 in the Grokster decision. And the defendant, Watson also argued the claims were invalid for obviousness, and the Federal Circuit disagreed with them, ruling the district court did not commit any clear error in its finding that in light of all the evidence, a person of ordinary skill in the art would not have had a reasonable expectation that Multac would reduce the risk of hospitalization in patients with certain risk factors, like persistent atrial fibrillation. And the court specifically credited Sanofi's expert testimony that a person of ordinary skill in the art would not draw an expectation about Multac from the clinical studies or any post hoc analysis. And the court went on, too, to discuss the clinical studies showed the suggested benefit was merely a potential. And the defendant cited to a publication where the benefit of reduced hospitalization was, quote unquote, expected, which they argued should be taken as a concrete assertion of the fact about what the authors expected. And it's interesting, the publication they actually cited to was a Sanofi publication. That may be something, an example of something that Dick mentioned earlier, where the IP folks are out of the loop, maybe not communicating with marketing or other people. But in any event, in response to that publication being cited by the defendants, an expert for Sanofi was able to testify that the statement would actually be understood as nothing more than a statement of the hypothesis being tested in the study the publication was based on. And so Federal Circuit was ultimately persuaded by that, holding the claims were infringed and not obvious. And the next case we're going to talk about is Vanda versus Westward here. So Vanda owns iloperidone, brand name Fanapt, which is an antipsychotic drug for treatment of schizophrenia. And upon filing their NDA, Vanda listed a reissue patent in the Orange Book. Westward later filed an ANDA for the generic version of the drug, where the ANDA label was substantially identical. And while their ANDA was pending, Patent Office issued Vanda's patent, and it was listed in the Orange Book as well. So then Westward went back and amended its ANDA to include a certification that that patent was invalid or not infringed. And then Vanda sued Westward for infringement of that same patent. So in response, Westward raised several defenses at trial, including that amending its ANDA could not constitute an act of infringement because the patent issued after the original ANDA filing date, and that this patent was invalid under Section 101 as directed to patent ineligible subject matter. So the court found that Westward's proposed generic drug induced infringement and that the patent was not invalid. So we'll talk about both of those in turn. But a little bit about the patent itself here. Patent disclosed a method of treating schizophrenia patients, which included analyzing the patient's genotype and determining a proper dosage based on that genotype. And the reason for that is they found the human body metabolizes this drug with an enzyme encoded by a specific gene, the CYP2D6 gene. Some individuals have low CYP2D6 activity, and they therefore poorly metabolize certain drugs like iloperidone here. So these patients, these poor metabolizers, are at a higher risk for an abnormal heartbeat and serious heart problems when treated with this drug. And so this patent teaches that those with the poor metabolizers who can be identified by genetic testing should be treated with a lower dose to reduce the risk of these health complications. So the finding of induced infringement here hinges really on the question of whether the defendant's proposed ANDA label included this genotyping step. So the label did not mention genotyping specifically, but it did mention quote-unquote laboratory tests. And there was conflicting testimony as to whether the reference to laboratory tests would lead to a physician performing these genotyping tests to determine if the patient was a poor metabolizer. So the court found this proposed label, this ANDA label, recommended, one, practitioners use iloperidone to treat patients suffering from schizophrenia, two, reduced dose for genotypic CYP2D6 poor metabolizers, and three, practitioners perform or have performed a genotyping assay to determine whether patients are these poor metabolizers. So the Federal Circuit focused in on the part of the label that recommended that practitioners have performed a genotyping assay to determine whether these patients are poor metabolizers. And experts for both parties testified that these laboratory tests are genotyping tests, but it's worth noting here that the defendant's expert actually testified there are other ways to test for the condition, things like titrating the dose, et cetera, that he himself would have done, but as long as some doctors would use these genotyping tests, that's enough for the purpose of inducement. So the Federal Circuit found no clear error in the district court's finding that when the label states laboratory tests are available to identify poor metabolizers, the label is referring to genotyping tests. And this is actually sort of interesting in occurrence where the label is broader than the claims themselves. To wrap up the infringement part of this case, Federal Circuit agreed with the district court that the label instructs doctors and recommends to perform these genotyping tests. And this is based on the idea that the proposed label instructs users to perform the method where the label may provide evidence of the applicant's affirmative intent to induce infringement. In other words, as we've been talking about, the label can evidence specific intent to infringe. So remember, under 271E, a patentee does not need to prove an actual past instance of direct infringement by a physician to establish infringement. The question really is whether, if a particular drug were put on the market, it would infringe the relevant patent. And so that's why a 271E infringement suit differs from typical infringement suits in that the infringement inquiries are hypothetical because the allegedly infringing product has not yet been marketed, and that's also why you will sometimes hear the filing of the ANDA referred to as an artificial act of infringement. So going back to Westward's argument that amending the ANDA could not constitute an act of infringement because the patent issued after the original ANDA filing date, the Federal Circuit addressed this issue, basically held that infringement can exist even where the patent issued after the original ANDA was submitted, and even though Vanda sued Westward for infringement prior to Westward submitting their paragraph 4 certification. So ultimately, Federal Circuit held that infringement analysis under 271E does require consideration of an amended ANDA. So amendments to an ANDA which include paragraph 4 certifications, even for a later issued patent, can constitute an act of infringement under 271E. And the Federal Circuit also pointed out prior to FDA approval, ANDA applicants generally must amend or supplement ANDAs to submit an appropriate patent certification for patents that issue after submission of the ANDA. And the court felt that this showed the regulatory framework expressly contemplates certifications for patents that issue after the ANDA is filed. So accordingly, the Federal Circuit affirmed the district court's holding that Westward's submission of their paragraph 4 certification was an act of infringement. And we're going to also talk about the patent eligibility issue in this case here. So in response to Westward's argument of patent eligibility under Section 101, the court noted that the claims did not simply instruct doctors to stop treating those patients with iloperidone based on information gathered from genotyping. So instead, the claims actually leveraged this natural phenomenon to improve treatment for schizophrenia, requiring the doctor to treat a patient with a specific low-dose range if she had a poor metabolizer genotype, or a specific high-dose range if she did not have such a genotype. And by leveraging this inherent property, the specific dosing protocol treated all such patients while still lowering the risk of health complications. So as a result, the court held that the claims in Vanda were not directed to a natural law, and as a whole, the invented treatment recited a specific new way to provide a therapeutic benefit to patients suffering from schizophrenia. So essentially, the inventors were able to develop a way to treat the disease in question based on their knowledge about this inherent property, the body's ability to undergo this phenomenon. And this case is a good example of how these types of claims can survive a patent eligibility challenge. Because you'll see in other cases where claims did not survive the 101 challenge, if you merely identify the existence of a pre-existing condition or an inherent property and you don't make any use of it, that can get you into some trouble. So for example, if your claims involve just screening for a condition and then recommending no treatment at all if that condition is present, you may not survive an eligibility challenge. But the claims here clearly go beyond just screening for a condition and actually leveraged that inherent property to improve treatment by adjusting the dosage. So, and this is what made the difference for them with the court here. So this case really also shows us that generic drug manufacturers accused of infringement should fully appreciate the subjective nature of a 101 defense when evaluating their litigation risk. So what happened to the defendants here? The district court enjoined Westward from commercial manufacture of their ANDA product prior to expiration, and the Federal Circuit agreed with this injunctive relief as provided for under Section 271E4. So that brings us to the Takeda case, which Dick will be telling us about.
Well, thank you, Melissa. Westward is featured in this case as well. Now, Takeda owned several patents that covered methods of administering colchicine, which is an anti-gout drug. Now, colchicine itself had been used to treat gout basically for centuries, and as a result was not covered by Takeda's patents per se, but Takeda did have two families of patents. One family was to treating acute gout patients, and there the patent teaches that the doctor should have the patient take 1.2 milligrams of their drug, of their colchicine, followed an hour later by a 0.6 milligram dose of colchicine. Now, Takeda's dose form was the 0.6 milligram tablet, which becomes important. The other family of patents was directed to methods of using colchicine as a prophylaxis for gout. Now, these methods involved the co-administration of colchicine with one of several other drugs, and which would prevent gout from occurring. Now, Westward was very clever. They filed what is called a 505(b)(2) application, relying on the 0.6 milligram dose of colchicine that Takeda had approved and the safety information for the colchicine. They did not file an application for treating either acute gout events or the co-administration of colchicine with another drug for prophylaxis. They filed simply for using the 0.6 milligram dose for prophylaxis of gout. Now, the label that Westward had provided, in quote, safety and effectiveness for acute treatment of gout flares during prophylaxis has not been studied. The label went on to tell the patient or doctor, if you have the gout while taking the drug, tell your healthcare provider. Now, Takeda's argument wasn't a bad one, that the latter statement induced infringement because in case of the patient taking the drug for prophylaxis, the physician would likely tell the patient to use the drug to treat the acute flare using Takeda's patented dosing regimen of 1.2 milligrams, followed an hour later by 0.6. However, the district court and the federal circuit disagreed with Takeda, saying that the statement to call the doctor was not sufficient to establish inducement by the label. Here, the label didn't tell you that if you were using colchicine as a prophylactic and you get an acute gout flare-up, use a double dose followed by a single dose. It simply said, call the doctor. So here, the doctor who winds up being the inducer of infringement, and doctors don't get sued for patent infringement. This is an example of regulatory and IP needing to communicate both as to how the drug was going to be used and as to the contents of the label. The patent clearly should have contemplated where somebody was using colchicine as a prophylactic, the possibility of a gout flare-up where one would then do patented method. Didn't have that. Neither did Takeda. Now, Takeda's label didn't have that either. Even for the prophylactic use in combination with another drug, there was no indication that if a flare-up occurred, you should go back and use the patented technique. So clearly, you have to put on the label a clear statement of what one should, what one must do. Now, Takeda is not an unusual case. We have three others, the HCNP that's cited in the footnote there, as well as Bayer. In both of those cases, the label did not have a positive, clear statement that you use the drug as set forth in the patent claims. In one case, it simply suggested that that might be a good idea, but no firm positive statement to do it. So your label not only has to, simply hinting at what to do isn't good enough. You actually have to say, do it. If this event occurs, do it. You don't say that, you're probably not going to be very successful in enforcing your rights. Now, the last topic we're going to talk about is, next slide, Alyssa, I'm sorry, adverse events. Now, adverse events is one of the things that is often discovered during the course of clinical trials. Many drugs fall into categories where it's common that adverse events will occur. For example, if you're in the treating schizophrenia, it's typical for antischizophrenic drugs to cause a number of different adverse events, including what they call pyramidal adverse event. And pyramidal simply means that the patient begins to have a motor capability that looks a lot like Parkinsonian disease. Other things will be metabolic processes will be adversely affected, such that the patient may gain weight or may adversely affect diabetes. So if you can, and there are others, there's a multitude for this. Now, here you have two things. You have to get your adverse event on the label and the fact that you're avoiding it or reducing it. And you've got to also have a claim, which is not going to be viewed as simply claiming the avoidance of the adverse event, which is an inherent property. You have to draft the claim properly. Now, in terms of the label, typically you're going to show the lack of an adverse event on your clinical trial area, and in particular, in the adverse events section. In this section, you should put in, you will have put in all the clinical trial evidence of adverse events. And typically you show a lack of it by comparing your drug versus placebo. For example, if the adverse event occurs at about the same rate as it occurs with placebo, that means your drug's probably not causing that event, and you can that will induce a doctor who's concerned about a patient having that event to use your drug as opposed to another. And weight gain is a big issue because of cardiovascular complications. So if you've got a drug which shows little or no weight gain, you're going to have a marketing advantage over the competing products. And a doctor who has a patient who already has a weight problem is clearly going to prescribe your drug rather than one of the competing drugs. Now, so how do I claim, the next slide, Alyssa, an adverse event on a patent and not get hit with inherency? Well, the way you do that, and I'm using here somebody with psychosis, an antipsychotic drug, you structure your claim so that you select the compound based on its property of not causing weight gain, or in this case, QT prolongation. Now, QT prolongation is another adverse event that occurs with antipsychotics, but it occurs with many other drugs as well. QT prolongation is simply a prolongation of the heartbeat, a delay in the heartbeat. If it's bad enough, patient dies. And even if it's not that bad, the patient has a lot of problems because he's not getting the blood flow and oxygen flow he needs to function correctly. So what you want to do is you want to set your claim up where you're treating psychosis, here psychosis, it could be whatever the disease, by selecting your compound. And that selection is based on its inherent property, but until that inherent property is known, no one can make the selection invention. So that's how you want to go about claiming these. The label is going to have it on there because it's going to have the clinical trial section. So in adverse events happen a lot. And if you've got a drug that doesn't have it, you've got a tremendous marketing advantage. And this is why your marketing people need to be involved, because they will recognize that, for instance, the lack of QT prolongation or the lack of weight gain is a significant market advantage that can be used. If you watch television and you see some of the ads, for instance, Latuda specifically mentions this lack of weight gain. That's a patented technique. So with that, I hope everyone has learned something. We had scheduled this for half an hour, and I think we're pretty close to being on time with that. If anyone has any questions, you can use the chat box, and Alyssa will be happy to answer them. And otherwise, you can email either Alyssa or I with your questions after this is over. And again, the slides and this entire presentation will be available on our website. Thank you, and have a great day.